وshare. If you remember the way in the first day we divided the steps or the stages of research into 4 steps. Planning, واخدنا في planning session 1 and session 2. Planning ends with a research proposal. Today we are going to discuss 2 steps. عشان كده it's too much, لكن it's just an outline. The 2 steps are data collection, conduction and data collection. In addition to that, an overview of data analysis or statistical analysis. We will discuss that later on. So because 2 steps are going to be discussed today, we better start straight away. It's already 10 past 10. فنبدأ على بركة الله وبسمه تعالى. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. What am I going to discuss today are the following issues related to conduction and data management. So conduction, we prefer conduction to data collection because it is not mere data collection. In health, we usually experiment and intervene. So we call it conduction of research. The other term in this title is data management. Why I use data management and not analysis? We will discuss this later on. So we have two parts. The conduction of research, which leads to or ends with the collection of data, and then the management of this data. 2 halves. بسم الله مرة أخرى ونبدأ. المواضيع اللي حنناقشها اليوم 4. First, sampling and sample selection, and also I'm going to discuss the difference between these 2. Sample selection is a type of sampling, and we will see that later on. Then I am going to touch on experimentation and interventions, and then data collection and preparing the data for analysis, and then data analysis. For me, I call data preparation and analysis data management, but people use the term differently. But I group preparing the data and analyzing it as managing data. So these are the 4 aspects I'm going to discuss, or the 4 parts. I will start with sampling and sample selection. And for that, I just want to remind you, when you define a problem and then you put your plan or research protocol, you might aim for collecting primary data, whether qualitative or quantitative, whether through observations, through a survey, through an experiment. All of that is called primary data. And for that, if you are reviewing it for someone, you need to ask them defining approaches. How did they define the contact method, the sampling plan? How are you going to do all of that? The instrument to be used, is it longer and more expansive, good for starting research? This one, primary data. Then you might be going for a collection of secondary. You go to databases or external information sources like the internet, search engines, and so on. This is quicker, but it is lower than data collection, and it is good for completing primary data. You might need secondary data to complement primary data. So we have 2 types of data to be collected: either primary data you collected directly, or secondary data from databases, external information, the internet, and so forth. So 2 types of data: primary and secondary data. Now, data, usually in health research, data is either from people or about people. So we can collect data directly from the participating elements or subjects, or about them from databases, from the internet, from wherever. So we can go for databases or records to collect data about people. and we can do experiments in laboratories or go to laboratories and collect data from labs. From the internet data sets, there are something called ready-made data sets. For example, the WHO collects data and publish this data in the form of data sets. So you can go straight to the internet, go straight to the WHO site and bring the data sets, ready-made data sets. So they are not from databases, but from these are published data sets. Also in the internet, there is something called analytics. They analyze data on the internet and produce some sort of data, and you can also access this data and use it. So collecting data doesn't always mean primary data. You can go to records, you can go to data sets and analytics in the internet. You can collect data from laboratories, and then you can collect data from the people themselves, either from their body by examining them, assessing them, or from their minds by talking to them, asking them about information about themselves, asking them about what they think about things, their perceptions, their attitudes towards things. So you can collect data about people and you can collect data from people, including data about them. So these are the two types of data you collect, primary or secondary. Just a reminder, when you conduct research, you already have an approved proposal. The first step after you have an approved proposal and you prepared everything, you start by selecting a sample of participants. And this we are going to discuss in detail. And then you collect data if it is observational. Even if it's an observation, a case study, a case control study. After you select your sample, you collect data about them from the records from wherever. And this is if it's an observational. So if it is experimental, you record baseline data, starting data before you do your experiment or your intervention, if it is needed before experiments or intervention. Then you carry out laboratory work if experimental, or carry out field or clinical interventions if interventional. And if you remember, we classified experimental into mere experimental if it is laboratory experimental, but if it is field, action research, preventive measures, etc., or clinical interventions, surgical or therapeutic, even preventive, which are in clinical interventions, all of these are done during the conduction of research. So after selecting the data, you collect the data, selecting the participants, you collect the data if it's an observational study, but if it is experimental, you record the baseline data, then you carry out the laboratory work if experimental, and carry out field or clinical interventions if interventional. This is the steps. And then you collect post-experimental interventional data. And this is usually called assessing the outcome of the intervention, assessing the outcome of the intervention. So these are the steps of the conduction. Another reminder, you remember, we defined the population, this is the theoretical one. And then we said there is something called the study population. And then the sampling frame, converting the study population into a list. And then you take a sample, which is the first step after approval of the proposal. Again, population, accessible population, then sample, then you get your subject research participants or informants. And of course, another reminder, we spoke about the sampling methods as being two. There are probability sampling. Well, probability sampling, the other name for it is random sampling. You can use these interchangeably. Non-probability sampling is another way, and it is called non-random sampling also. So we have two types of sampling, and if you remember these sampling techniques, the probabilistic or the random, like the stratified, the simple random, the systematic, and the cluster. These are four. And the non-probabilistic or non-random are the snowball, the convenience, the judgmental, and the quota. There are others, but we said we are going to focus on those 8. Now, for observational studies, after you identified your and defined your population, you select what is known as the sampling frame. And this is very important. You need to have a list of your subjects or items. And this is called the sampling frame. Then you choose which sampling method you are going to use, depending on your setting, your budget, your who is participating with you. So the setting will force you to choose a very specific sampling method. So you choose the sampling method. If you can use a random one, then which one of the random is it going to be? Which one is the most suitable? Is it simple? Is simple random enough? Do you need to stratify? Do you want to make it simple and select using systematic sampling? Are you going to use a cluster sampling? 4. ولا هتاخد you are going to take non-random, and then the non-random, you know, the 4 non-random ones, the quota, the convenience, and all of it. So after you choose the sampling method, and you already know you calculated the sample size, then you select your sample and collect your data. These are for observations. So there is no intervention. There is no intervention in observational studies. So if we can go very quickly, before that, there are some important considerations before you take your sample. For example, how are you going to recruit participants? Whether it's an observational study or an interventional study. Because you need people. How are you going to recruit? From where? And how the technique you are going to use to recruit? How are you going to publish about your research? So recruitment of participants is an important step you need to consider before you take the sample. For example, if recruitment is difficult, then you might opt to take a larger sample because you aim at a larger sample. Maybe with difficulty, you get the sample that you require. For example, if you cannot collect the whole sample before you start the experiment, and you are collecting it on the run while you are doing the experiment or the research, then you do something called block randomization. Block randomization. You select a block and you take a sample, then you select another block and so on. So the type of random selection and randomization or random assignment depends on the participants and the setting. Also, you need to specify selection criteria if you are going to select participants rather than just sample them. And then you need to take care of what is known as selection bias. There is something called concealment of selection and allocation. People do not know the people, they do not know the participants. So when they select, there is no bias. So you need to avoid selection. And then, of course, you need to be very careful when you select data and you decide whether you are going to select from people, from their body, or from their mind. So these are important considerations before. Another reminder again, there is simple random, there is stratified random, there is systematic random, cluster random. And if you use more than one of these, then it is a multi-stage sampling. For the non-probability, there is a purpose or purposive sampling, or it's also called judgment sampling. There is convenience sampling, snowball sampling, and quota sampling. We will introduce these very quickly. First of all, these are the 4 types, main types of non-probability or random sampling. And by the way, the first one is simple random. The other 3 also end up with simple random. So if I say I'm going to systematic random is systematic random. There is no simple, but when it is stratified, you make the strata, then you apply simple random. In cluster, you define your clusters, then you use simple random. So simple random is on its own use, and it is also used with the stratified and cluster sample. Let us start with البروبابيلتي sampling. الانواع بتاعتها هذه probability sampling. We start with the first one. In simple random, random selection or random selection, this simple random selection, each item in the sample frame, you have a list, a sample frame, you need to apply a technique in which each item will have a known and equal chance of being selected. This is very important. So this is the first step. Then the researchers prepare the sampling frame and then use what they call random numbers tables. In the past, there are some random number tables. Then you put them on the table and you close your eyes and put your finger in a number and then go down or go to right, left, or up. You decide before you do this. But this is now replaced by computer applications, example, Excel, OpenAPI, and other random number generators in the market. So you either use tables like this one, you put your finger somewhere in the middle while you cover your eyes and then put your finger anywhere, but you decide before you do that you are going to go down or up or right or left and so on. So this was in the past, but now people use Excel or OpenAPI or other applications. So the simple random is very simple. You use for the computer application, which will identify for you the participant. The systematic one, you decide based on, for example, the size of your, for example, if I have, in my sample frame, I have 2,000 participants listed, and I want 100. So I will divide. I will say, okay, I will divide the 2,000 by 100 is an each 20th person or 90th or below that. لا يعني I will start with the largest number, but I may decide, no, I'm going to take the 15th. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 15th I will take, then 30, 45, and this is called systematic random sampling. Also, you can start in the middle. So I say I'm going to take the 5th, but I will put my finger in the middle of the sample frame and then start counting each 5th. So to increase this random probability. So this is called systematic random. Or you say, I'm going to sit in the clinic and each 5th person, 5th patient that comes in, or I'm going to sit in the classroom and the 5th student entering the class, this is all called systematic random sampling. Then we have stratified sampling. You need to define your strata. What do you mean by strata? I will say, for example, I want to select 100 participants, but my population is a mixture of people living in Dubai and people living outside Dubai. And also we have males and females, and we have old and young, and we have nationals and expatriates. And I need to have all of them have an equal chance of being selected. So I am going to divide them into strata. I will start with nationals and expatriates. Then I will stratify the nationals into males and females. And then from the males, old and young. And then young living in Dubai and young living outside Dubai. And then from each of the strata, I select a number of participants. So this is called stratified random sampling. And when I come to the selection, I use a simple random using computer software. This is called stratified sampling. So what I need to do, first of all, I bring my sample frame and then start generating the strata. and then deal with each stratum by dividing it in another 2 or 3 strata and so on. The fourth the fourth random sampling one, for example, I want to select students in secondary schools of UAE, but I cannot have a sampling frame. The accessible population is too large. So I say, okay, to represent all schools, not all schools in all areas, I cannot put them all in one sampling frame. Maybe some areas I will not select a participant from the area, or maybe I will not select participants from the school. So I need to make clusters for that. Usually the clusters are geographical. I will say I'm going to make clusters. For example, schools in Dubai, schools in Sharjah, schools in and so on. So I will have, say, 7 clusters. Then from schools in Sharjah, what are the schools? I am going to put them in all the schools in Sharjah, and then randomly select a percentage of them. I'm going to say I'm going to select 50% of the schools in Sharjah, 50% of the schools in Dubai, 50% of the schools in Abu Dhabi, and so on. So I make the cluster, and then I specify the number of schools that I'm going to select. I select from them randomly, simple random. And then from each school, I am going to select 10% of the students randomly. So this is called cluster sampling. So these are the 4 probability. These are the clusters. So these are the 4 types of probability. The non-probability sampling ones, the first one is called judgmental or purposive. This is very important to us because this is the one which we use for clinical trials. We don't use the probability ones. Usually we use judgmental. Judgmental means what? Based on my judgment, based on my experience, based on my ability to determine selection criteria, my ability to determine inclusion or exclusion criteria. This is called judgmental or purposive. Purposive because we need them for a very special purpose. We need participants with very specific criteria. So this is called judgmental or purposive. Then we have convenience. Based on convenience, because of difficulties in this, because of limitation in this, I am going to select what I can. I will take the samples that I can access. So this is called convenience. There is quota, and then for quota is very similar in a way to stratified and similar in a way to a cluster. But for example, for a specific gender, I'm going to say I'm going to take 60% of males and 40% of females. So this is called quota sampling. You define a quota. Then there is the 4th type. It is called the snowball sampling. It is similar to judgmental. I select people for a purpose, but I cannot select the whole number that I need. I will select, for example, 10 and ask these 10 to bring me more participants using the selection criteria I provide them with. And then when they select more participants, I will ask the new participants to select other participants based on the selection criteria. And then I'm going to just confirm. This is called snowball sampling. So these are the 4 types, but I'm more interested in the purposive sampling or judgmental one, or the based on expertise, purposive. And the purposive sampling, also known as judgmental, it is you use appropriate criteria, selection criteria or characteristics of the sample members. And then if you don't have a very specific objectives and criteria, this is not purposive sampling. And then if it is multi-purpose objectives are involved, you don't use this. And then the investigators will pick up only a sample relevant to the study. And this is true for clinical trials. And then you need to have full knowledge of the universe, which means a representation of these samples. And how do you do it? Depending on the type of non-probability sampling, researchers use personal judgment, the subject selection. And then each subject is chosen is considered represented. It is just considered representative of the population. And then, and this is used usually in qualitative, mainly in qualitative studies. This is the purposive or judgmental sample. The convenience sampling, as I told you before, it depends on the circumstances. I will do what I can. I cannot apply a strict criteria for selection. The quota sampling, I already explained that you specify a quota for each group to be involved, and then you select them. And then finally, I explained the snowball sampling, which you select one and they select more and so on. This is the first quarter of our session today, which is about sampling. If you have questions, this is the time for you to ask the questions. Any questions about how to sample, sampling techniques, the 8 types, the 8 proposed types of sampling techniques?
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Mardi. Thank you very much. Amazing. Actually, maybe this is the first time ever, though we have done research in our life, but maybe this is the first time to know that much detail about the sampling size. Regarding when we select, I believe that we should also, based on the information provided, we should select also the type of sample according to the type of the study that we are doing. Like, if when you said about the block
sample.
Block sample.
Is block sampling or block randomization?
A block randomization. This won't fit if it's an interventional study. It won't fit with the block randomization, right? Because for any interventional study, if we are doing an interventional study, this to my knowledge, that we need to unify or start with the same treatment. For example, if we have a control or a treatment group, we have to start from the start or from the beginning with both groups with the same standards, with the same environment, with the same circumstance. So we cannot go on with the adding more participants or more number or more, whether it's a people or any sort of, in vivo, whether it's an animal model or an human model, right?
Well, in the contrary, in the contrary. This is usually used for clinical trials, especially human clinical trials. Why do they use blocks, selection and block randomization? Because they cannot guarantee that they will have the size of the the number of participants that they require for the intervention. So we will start our trial with whatever patients we can find. Then as we are proceeding with our experiment, we can add more participants. But we need to do what they call block randomization. And what do they mean by that? They will wait until they collect, for example, 10 new recruits, and then they randomize and divide them into 2 groups. Then they wait until they can collect another 10 participants, and then they randomly allocate them to the 2 groups of the arms of the experiment. So in fact, block randomization, by the way, let me remind you, there is the random selection and randomization. In clinical trials, it is non-random because it is purposive. It is,
yes, right.
So we select using selection criteria. After we select, as you know, we select a number, then we assign them into the 2 arms of the experiment. One group, we will give them the new medicine. The other group, we will give them the placebo or the other medicine. And so we need to select the 10 using selection criteria. Once we have the 10, then we randomize. We randomly
Okay.
assign the 2 arms. So this is called block randomization.
Excellent, very clear. Then if you allow me to ask another question based on this.
Yes, sure.
When, in which type of study then, you won't be able, or there is any sort of restriction that you won't be able to add more participants after you start your experiment?
What do you mean?
Like, doctor, now if it's even in a clinical, which I understand very clearly, and I could reflect it in many examples. If I'm allowed to add more while on the go, I'm allowed to add more numbers or more participants to the sample. Is there any sort or type of studies that I'm restricted to identify the number of participants and not to add more after the start of the study? I have to be clear.
Okay. This is very important. We are going to discuss that later on about there is something called per protocol analysis. There is another type of analysis called intention to treat analysis. So if you first decide on a very specific and strict protocol, and you want to do later on per protocol analysis, which means, for example, I have a trial that is going to continue for 1 year. I will say I am going to use block randomization, adding participants up to 6 months, because the minimum time to use the drug is 6 months. I cannot select more patients on the 8th month, because I will not have enough time to actually complete the protocol. I need to complete the whole protocol, so I cannot take more patients after 6 months are passed. So this is one example. This is one example. So you might have this. Another example, I am going to conduct this experiment in winter, because in winter there is factors. There are factors. Once winter ends, then I will not. Now I have summer. The atmosphere is hot. This is a confounding factor. I cannot add more participants after winter ends. So on, there are many examples in which you cannot add more participants after you start your trial.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Prof. Mardi. Thank you very much for the answer.
Any questions, more questions or comments? Okay.
I have one suggestion, Prof. Mardi, if no questions.
Okay.
If you allow me. Fifth year students, anything regarding students, maybe I'm not aware of it, because they have graduation project and for a research graduation project. And they used last year, we came across that they are not fully aware about such details about research.
Actually,
so,
primer, they were supposed to be invited to this.
Yes, doctor, they were invited, but the attendance was very high in the first session. After that, there is reluctance of attendance and joining the sessions, but all of the batches were sent the invitation.
Maybe we need to offer it to them alone. Then we will.
Or maybe they are busy with exams or rotation or something. There must be a reason behind their absence.
Actually, their exam have been preponed from December to November. But if maybe if we correlate it, or we tie it up to their graduation research project, or we make it I mean, they can understand the relevance of this course in relation to their research graduation project, they will understand the value of it.
Okay.
Yes, that would be great. I think we can also highlight that they are already included in the LMS course, and they can see the recording of the session, inshallah.
But maybe, as Islam said, we might need to customize it a little bit to suit their needs.
صحيح صحيح. Yeah.
Okay.
That would be, Prof. Mardi, of great help to them, because last year, as far as I was concerned, last year they were really in a really in a total mess when it came to the part that I could know about it only. They were really unoriented regarding how to even conduct a graduation project.
By the way, as institutions usually have a course for teachers called Train the Trainers or Training the Trainers, then a course also called Training the Supervisors. Yani, you cannot allocate supervisors to students, and not all of the supervisors are quite aware of the issues related to research and supervision. So maybe you might need, Rasha, to think about training supervisors course or the elective, your course you might need. Okay, somebody wants to comment, please go ahead, comment or ask question. Okay, maybe the microphone was unmuted accidentally. Anyhow, let us move to the second half or section of Hagiga. We have done with sampling and sample selection. Now, what about experimentation and intervention? You selected your sample, but it is not an observational study, it's an experimental study. You need to do some experimentation and intervention. First, before you intervene, you need to collect baseline data, because your results will be compared to the baseline data. So you need to collect baseline data before. Then you lab experiment, then you conduct your experimentation. Let me just unmute Najla. Okay, and Magda. Okay, and Abdul Hafiz. Okay, we just a minute, please. Yeah, okay. You conduct your lab experiments. This is the second step after you establish your baseline data. Then if you have a field or a clinical trial, field trials, for example, if you want to have a campaign, a smoking cessation campaign, or you want to make people do more exercise. So if your intervention is related to prevention, then you do it in the field. And if it's a clinical trial, then you do it in the healthcare facilities. You do that. This is part of your intervention or experimentation. After that, the outcomes are assessed. And a very important point related to outcome assessment, that it should be done by qualified and trained investigators. They know how to assess. For example, you cannot ask, for example, a nurse to check for a murmur or check for something that she is not trained to do. So the assessors need to be trained. Also, there is something called the risk of bias. You need to minimize the risk of bias through blinding and follow-up. Blinding means those who care for patients, those who assess outcomes, those who give the medicines, all of this should be blinded. So it is, and even the patients should be blinded to avoid bias. Also, you need to follow up patients so that you minimize bias. And I'm going to discuss this a little bit more in the following slides. So you need to deal with the risk of bias, and we have confounders. I am going to talk about them after I list the sources of bias. What are the types and sources of bias? When you design your experiment, there is something called design bias. If you do something not quite to the standards, then this is called design bias. It will affect the outcome. Even the data collection form, if it is not appropriate, this is called design bias. Even if you selected a technique for interviewing or a technique, you used a technique that doesn't work, this is called design bias. There is selection bias, and we know that, and this is why there is something called concealment of selection, concealment of assignment. The person who selects uses selection criteria and they don't know anything beyond that. So you don't, you avoid selection bias and randomization or assignment bias. Then there is procedure bias. This is very important. When you are conducting the experiment, this is called the procedure, the experiment or the intervention. Even the procedure for assessment of outcomes, the procedure for the intervention, giving the medicines, the care, there's care bias, care bias. If nurses know that this patient is receiving a placebo, they might care for them more because they know it's not receiving the real thing. So this is called care bias. And this is why nurses should be blinded. The caregivers should be blinded. So there is something called procedure bias, including all the procedures. And then the measurement bias, which is assessment of the outcome of the experiment, whether it's an experiment or an intervention, a clinical intervention. Then there is an additional type of bias, it's called publication bias, and this is beyond your field, but you need to, you need to be interested in this because you need to know the journals which have publication bias to avoid. Okay, what are the confounding factors? In each of these, if there is a factor that lead to affect the outcome of the intervention, it is called the confounder or the confounding. So what are these confounding factors? Can I open a discussion now? Have you heard about confounding and confounding factors? And do you know any confounding factors in clinical trials? Because they are sources of bias. Anybody would like to participate? Confounding factors. What are these confounding factors in clinical trials?
Confounding factors, I think the other risk, yani if I am searching for certain point in a disease related to risk of certain disease, and I choose samples at which I have already established risk factors for this disease, this may act as a confounding. So, for example, in people having hypertension, and I can search for a new marker or risk factor, or like for example, polymorphism in certain gene or something, and I choose people having already renal disease or having a high lipid. I think this is we have to exclude these people to avoid the confounding factor. So the people having other risk factors should be, or the sample having other risk factors should be excluded from the work to seek for accuracy of the risk factor that you are searching for.
Okay, thank you very much. You extended, you answered my question by extending it to observational studies, which is good, very good, excellent. You dealt with confounding as far as observational studies are concerned, which is fantastic. Thank you very much. But we need to also address confounding in clinical trials. So if I am conducting a clinical trial, I'm giving one patient, one group of patients a new intervention, and I'm using another group as controls. What sort of confounding factors that can affect the result of this intervention? What could this be? While patients are receiving medicines, two groups of patients, either one group receiving drug A, another group receiving drug B, or one group receiving the new drug, and the others are receiving the placebo. What sort of factors that can confound and lead and affect the outcome?
Also, I think This in the clinical trials, you have to search for the exclusion factor that may affect the treatment itself. So in the design of the study, you should be careful when you choose the sample. You should avoid all the people, for example, if they have, for example, in liver disease, and I'm searching for certain effect on fibrosis or something, I should, in certain group of patients, so I should exclude them, exclude the other risk factors for fibrosis. If I search in hepatitis, people having hepatitis, for example, I should exclude some other fact, or in cancer of liver, I should exclude people having hepatitis C, for example, because I want to see if there is some risk factor for this disease. I should exclude the other factors also in the same way.
Okay,
So,
you went back to observational studies. You went back to observational.
but yes, maybe I don't have example in my work for interventional this way.
Dina
Pharmacology to guide us in these issues.
Dina mentioned one of the most important factors, confounding factors, and she said non-compliance. Yes, you need to follow up patients to make sure that they comply, because non-compliance is a very important source of confounding bias. So thank you, Dina. This is the first one in my list too. What other factors that can be considered confounding factors?
Can we consider?
Yes.
Can we consider pharmacogenomics, pharmacogenetics, or no?
What do you mean?
I mean, because different people respond to medicine by different ways.
Well, you, and also Najla, you addressed issues related to selection criteria. So when you select the participants to start with, if there is any factor that you think could be a confounding factor, you take it into consideration during the selection of your participants. You can select them based on selection criteria, inclusion and exclusion. If you are quite aware of a factor that could be a confounding one, then you say, we need to check them for this, and if it is there, then we are going to exclude them because this factor is a confounding one.
Mm.
But these are called non-confounding factors. And when you randomize, randomization deals with known and unknown confounding factors. Even if you know them and you cannot exclude patients, you randomize them so that they will be distributed evenly between the two arms of the experiment. So even these types of factors, genetic ones or structural ones or whatever, if you cannot avoid them, you randomize, and this randomization will deal with known and unknown prognostic factors. This one, prognostic factors. But what other factors while we are actually conducting the experiment? I will then flash them one by one and ask you whether you know their meaning or not. The second one is called co-intervention. This is a confounding factor. What do I mean by that?
If you have any other type of treatment applied other than the current treatment, maybe in cancer, مثلا, you have
Yes, exactly.
radiation plus the chemotherapy.
Yes, Diana said, if the patient is already taking another treatment, you need to be aware of that. So you need to follow up patients, that to ask them first to start with, and you need to also follow them that if they, for example, they develop any type of another, say a flu, and then they just go to the pharmacy and buy something and start using it. You need to be following patients up so that they do not use another, even medication or otherwise. Maybe they are advised by someone not to eat something, or advised by someone to do some exercise. This will be considered as an intervention that might affect your experiment. So co-intervention. What about crossover? What about, and it happens.
الغاز يا دكتور.
Crossover means, and it is known, if people know that they are involved in a study, they are neighbors, or they were in the same workplace, and then they discover that they are involved in the same trial, they might ask, one patient might ask another one, are you improving? And if they say, yes, I am improving, she will ask her neighbor to give her some of the tablets she is using. So unintentionally, she crosses over from one arm of the experiment to the other arm of the experiment, from the placebo to the treatment or otherwise. This is called crossing over during the experiment. What about contamination? And how is it different from co-intervention and crossover? Contamination means I am using the drug given to me by the investigators, but I am also using the other drug given to another person. I am contaminating. I am using the drug and the placebo at the same time. This is called contamination. And then count, this is something not related directly to the intervention. It is this disappearance of some of the participants. It's called attrition. Attrition, it means I started with 100 and ended up with an 80. I lost. It's lost to follow up. I cannot find them. So I cannot report the results of my experiment. And this is when you need to decide to start with. I told you there are two types of analysis. There is an analysis called per protocol analysis. It means you need to complete the protocol so that I can add you to the analysis. And there is something called intention to treat analysis, which means since I put you in the experiment, I'm not going to exclude you even if I lose you up. I'm going, if you disappear, I will consider that you are treated. I know you died, or you developed an unfavorable outcome. So this is called intention to treat analysis, and the other one is called protocol analysis. This to deal with this count. And also we have something called care. Care is a confounding factor. If one group is cared for more than the other group, this is confounding factor. You need to follow up, and you need to blind caregivers so that this confounder is abolished or minimized. So these are the four sources of confounding factors, which are considered sources of bias in clinical trials or interventional trials. This is a summary of the errors that can happen in research. And as you can see, they are listed in different ways, but there is selection bias, there is measurement bias, and there is confounding bias. And the confounding we already mentioned. And there are measures on how to deal with these sources of bias. Any questions related to that? Intervention and the risk of bias and dealing with the risk of bias. Okay. Okay, let us proceed with the third section. Halas, I did my intervention. I need to collect the data and then prepare the data for analysis. So this section deals with two issues: the collection of data and preparing it for analysis. And I'm going to spend more time on preparing the data for analysis than data collection and data analysis, because this is an issue which is often ignored, leading to poor results. Now, what is and how is data collected? Of course, you know, there are many methods used for data collection, including, for example, here they are mentioning surveys, they mean questionnaires, and then there are interviews, focus group, online tracking, marketing analysis, monitoring social media, subscription. This is done for the different types of studies, not the health one, but for health, you can use the same, the forms and questionnaires, interviews, observation, means recording and checklisting. Then you can go to documents and records and pull data from there. You can sit with groups and conduct focus group discussions. You can take oral histories. You can do what is known as combination research, this and that together. Online tracking and marketing and social media are the same. So this is these are the different types of data collection tools and techniques. So for observational studies, we use these tools for this. We use different tools. Field interview methods, questionnaire methods, focus group, Delphi, projective techniques. All of these are primary methods for data collection for observational studies. So the interviews, the questionnaires, observation, and the collection of data post-experimental. And then the records, as you can see them at the last there, the records are also used. So questionnaires, interviews, direct observation, focus group, and records. Now, for each, the structure and techniques for use are adequately described. If you want to know about how to use questionnaires, there is a lot of literature and publications. You go and then you find what are the characteristics of questionnaires, how do you design them, what are the different types, and you can also find examples. So questionnaires are all over the place. There are books about questionnaire designs, and there are even time frames for how to draft the instrument first, iterate for about 4 weeks, then make a pilot to focus content, and you revise and repeat for another 2 to 3 weeks, and then you test and debug, and then you focus it with another fact-focused pilot for another 2 to 3 weeks. Then there is something called you translate if you are going to use it. For example, if you design it in English and you want to use it for Arabic, you need to translate and back translate. There is something called validation, and then you produce the final instrument. So people believe that questionnaires need to be done very carefully using this time frame. Now, questionnaires, interviews, and focus groups are mostly wide, and then we can use data collection forms, can also be question-based as part of other types, including the collection of laboratory data or interventional data, post-intervention and pre-intervention. Now, for experimental studies, laboratory experimentation and field experimental interventions and the clinical trials, including preventive interventional action research to study the effect of positive health determinants. For you do these experiments, you collect the data, the clinical trials, all of these. During each phase of these phases, you collect data, you analyze, you might actually come up with recommendations based on preclinical laboratory studies for several years. Then you go into phase 1, addressing the safety, and then you collect data, analyze, and so on. So for interventional clinical trials, for each level, you can collect data. If you have if you remember, you have an experimental group, no control group, and it is just a clinical trial, you just collect pre-intervention data and post-intervention data. And then you analyze and you produce your results. But if an experimental and control group, then you do the same, but you collect data for both. And this is a controlled clinical trial. You can use analysis of data. It's an analytic type of experimentation. If also the subjects are randomly assigned, there is different type of collection of data, post-randomization and pre-experimentation and post-experimentation for the two groups, and then you analyze them. And of course, you know, there is the quasi. For these 4 types, you do data collection. You use data collection forms to record laboratory data and other participants' data. When I say other participants' data, it might be just their bio data or their clinical profile before the experiment, the baseline data, and then you can ask them about what they think about things. It can be a questionnaire addressing issues related to their attitudes towards something. So data collection forms to collect data about all these issues are used. Then these can be used prospectively and retrospectively, but they are data collection forms. They can be about the participants from records. You collect data from databases, or through questioning of the patients, or from participants through evaluations, mean examining them and questioning them, both. Of course, blinding of assessors and data collectors, you need to do it because it minimizes the risk of bias we talked about during the conduction of research. Okay, this is the second part, which is this is the first half of the third part. Now, you collected the data using the different types of tools and techniques. There are steps that you do, which are collectively called data management. And data management includes preparing the data first, then cleaning the data before you actually deal with it. You just clean it. Then you can manipulate and transform the data through calculations and other types of manipulations. Then you collate the data, you reorganize, you organize, you tabulate. Then you examine the data. It's called examination or inspection of the data. And then you analyze the data. So you have 6 steps of data management. I'm going, as I told you earlier, to spend some time dealing with data preparation. You gather the data, you look at it generally, and then you clean it, you transform it, enrich it, and store it, and then you analyze. Alexander Graham Bell, اخترع التلفون, this is the scientist who invented the phone, said before anything else, preparation is the key to success. If you don't prepare the data well, the next steps will all go down the drain. So what do we need to do to prepare the data? The first thing you do, you need to code the data. What we mean by coding the data, of course, you have a data collection form. In the data collection form, you have 2 things. You have the variables, you need to code the variables, and the data entered in these containers. You need to also code it. I will give one example. There is a question called date of birth. Date of birth. I don't want to use the whole term when I am dealing with data. So I will code it as DOB. So DOB is the code for date of birth. Now, when the person enters the date, I can say I am going to classify the date into young, old, and very old, for example, or child, infant, neonate, etc. So I am going to code all of these. I am going to code neonate using the letter N, and then a child, infant using the letter I, child using the letter C, adult using the letter A, etc. So I am going to make codes for the variables and codes for the data, so that when I come to the next step in preparing the data, I am going to use the codes rather than the actual names or titles of the variables and the data. And by the way, in the software, they call the actual coded variables or data the labels. So you need to make a label for each code, and the labels are listed and they are used in the computer application. If items are short, they are used as codes. Yani age, you don't need to code it, because it's all 3 letters. If the items are short, they are used as codes. Data is then entered in a computer and Excel in an Excel file or an SPSS dictionary. This is the next step after you code the data. And then if you use an electronic data collection form, it is ready. It can be used directly. And if you use Google Form or Microsoft Forms or SurveyMonkey or whatever, Get Form or Dot Form, these are ready. These are electronic data collection forms. You do not need. When you design them, you already use codes, so they are ready. And then you are done with data preparation. You prepared the data. What do you do for the data after it is inside? You first clean it. It's called data cleaning. And you clean data because you might have some issues. Of course, just a reminder, we have the types of data, the categorical data, which is nominal and ordinal. And this data, data account حقها في الكاتيجوريكال is always discrete. يعني ما بنحسبه يعني. The data count is discrete. يعني 3 children ولا 4 years ولا 5 doctors. They are counts and they are usually discrete. And these can be organized and presented as frequency distribution data. I think I moved into data presentation. Just a minute. So never mind. This data can be presented in a graphical format, اللي هو اسمه bar chart or pie chart. Actually, this slide was not about data cleaning. Data cleaning, you need to examine the data before you manipulate so that you make sure that the person who entered the data did not make any mistakes. And there are techniques for data cleaning. Very simple. For example, in SPSS or Excel, you just create a frequency distribution table. And when you look at the results, the output, you can identify whether there are some additional codes which were not there so that you know there are some mistakes. So data cleaning, you need to clean that before you manipulate or transform the data. What do we mean by data transformation or manipulation? For example, if I have اسمه transformation برضو. For example, if I have the age, I ask people to enter their age. I can then convert these ages into age groups. Yani people will say, I am 19 years old, I am 17 years old. I can convert that into age groups. This is called data manipulation or transformation. Another example, if you enter your date of birth, I can convert your date of birth into age. So this is called data transformation or manipulation. So the advice is you retain the raw data because you can need it to refer to it later, or you can do further analysis of data. Maybe after you do your preliminary analysis, you discover that you need the raw data. Because some people ask, why enter age if you need age groups? Why don't you put it to start with in your questionnaire? Well, I need the exact age. Maybe I need the exact age and also the age groups. So I start with the age as it is, raw. Then I convert it through manipulation or transformation into age groups. maybe I need to do some calculations. For example, if I measure the blood pressure and record the systemic and the systolic and the diastolic, I might need to calculate the pulse pressure. So this is called calculation. I need to calculate a percentage of something. This is called calculation. So calculations are also considered data manipulation. So you need to manipulate data after you clean it before you start dealing with the data. Okay, I coded the data, I cleaned it, I manipulated it. I now need to collate the data, bring the data or reorganize it. This is called data collation. So collation is assembled, sorted, and ordered, then organized and presented or exhibited. And there are two types of products. You can organize the data and present it as tables, and you can use the data and present it as graphs. So you can produce a table or a graph. This is a table that the distribution, frequency distribution tables, or graphs, any type of graph. So this is called data collation and presentation, organization and presentation. Then there is something called data examination or inspection. I look at the data, whether the data before manipulation, the data before organization, or data after manipulation and after organization. I examine all this data and then detect the features. Why do I examine? It's also known as inspection, to identify the main features of the data of the sample. And I examine to identify the main features of the data. For example, the maximum and minimum values, the identified features and measures, and the products of correlation are also, all of these are known as, when you examine data, these are known as descriptive statistics. Isn't the results of examination of data after cleaning, manipulation, organization, correlation, and all of that, you examine it. Whatever you come up with is called descriptive statistics. Then you can use it to describe. Finally, you analyze the data. I will stop here and ask questions if you like. Then we move to data analysis. Okay, I'm going to use the 5 minutes I reserved for questions to move ahead. Data analysis. What sort of data analysis? We described two types of data analysis when we addressed, when you prepare your proposal. You need to specify. First of all, why didn't, collation and organization, I said we can produce descriptive statistics, but there is something called statistical analysis, which is defined as applying statistical methods and tests to data to gain understanding of a larger population. So this is called statistical analysis. Okay, analysis of data. When you examine data, as I mentioned earlier, using a statistical, you can examine data using a statistical test. This is true statistical analysis. When you apply or use a test, it produces inferential statistics, while data examination after correlation and organization is called descriptive statistics. So the statistics resulting from tests are used for inference اللي هو شنو predictions and generalization. So inferential statistics are used for predictions and generalization, for passing judgments about relationships or differences and determining parameters of the population. So inferences include all of these. And so we have descriptive statistics and we have inferential statistics. Before I start, there are a number of applications or software people use for statistical analysis, but these are the most commonly used: Stata, SPSS, Prism, Minitab, and SAS. These are the major statistical analysis software or applications. Now, for descriptive statistics, these result from data collation organizations, whether tabular or graphical, and inspection or examination of data. Whatever result, whether this result is ready-made or a result of manipulation and transformation, this is called, or even correlation and organization, the results are called statistics, descriptive statistics. So these are the descriptive statistics, and they just used to describe the sample, not the population. You cannot say inhabitants of Oman are all between the age of this and that. If the sample is small, you are describing the data. You are describing the sample, not the population. Now, this can provide just assumptions about the population, not inferences. You cannot generalize. You can just say assumptions. Now, and these include two major types of descriptive statistics. The measures of central tendency, you can say the average age is kida, or the mean age is kida. The variability is like that. So there are two types of descriptions: central tendency and measures of dispersion. If you say the standard deviation, this is a measure of dispersion. How is data dispersed around the central mean? Examples include the mean, the median, the mode, standard deviation, the minimum, the maximum, the frequencies, the graph. All of these are descriptive statistics. Now, to summarize them, there are measures of central tendency, including the mean, the median, and the mode, and the measures of dispersion around the mean are the range, the quartile range, standard deviation, and the variance. These are the descriptive statistics. And some people add the graphs, and they add the shape as the shape of the graph as another form of descriptive statistics. The measures of central tendency, I already mentioned them. And then there are the measures of dispersion, the range, the variance, and standard deviation, and the dispersion or variance. While inferential statistics, different from descriptive in being the outcomes and products of statistical tests, not just inspection and examination. You do tests, and these are used for predictions and generalizations. And these tests include mainly the hypothesis testing, including the chi-square test and the student's t-test as examples, the correlation and regression test, the analysis of variance tests. These are the three major that you need to know what they are and how they are used. By the way, in clinical trials, there are other terminologies. We will in the future, inshallah, have a whole workshop about clinical trials, because there are other tests used, and people use the results as inferential statistics. There are many tests, ratios, the odds ratios, many other tests used in clinical trials that we are not going to deal with today, but they are there, and we will discuss them with clinical trials. But these are the main inferential statistics: estimating parameters, estimates, and then regression, correlation and regression analysis, the confidence interval, and the hypothesis testing. I mentioned two of them: the student's t-test and the chi-square testing, one for values and the other for counts. Okay, this is the end of the session, and I am sorry I used more time. Any questions? Final questions?
Thank you, Doctor.
Stop sharing. We look at the chat if there is anything. Okay, nothing in the chat and no questions, no raised hand. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies, yes, Eunice is there. Okay. Abdul Hafiz is there. Okay. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and I will see you later, inshallah.
Thank you, Dr. Abdul Manan. Thank you, everyone.